welcome to The World Transformed. This program is your guide to an astounding future that lies ahead, a future that will be here sooner than you think, and that you have an important role to play in bringing about. At The World Transformed, we want to introduce you to what may be the greatest transformation of them all, the one that begins with considering and acting on the almost limitless possibilities that lie before us, and that ends somewhere beyond the reach of the human imagination. So, when does this amazing future begin? Well, today is the day. My name is Phil Bowermaster, and with me in the virtual studio is my co-author, co-futurist, and co-host, Stephen Gordon. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, Phil. How are you?
Well, I am super fantastic. Happy Monday. How are you, my friend?
Man, I'm doing great. Doing great. This one.
Are you feeling enlightened at all? Let me ask you that. Let's just start with that.
Well, that
critical question.
That is the question, because we're going to delve kind of deep into the intellectual underpinnings of, this show and really
of everything we do
right now.
Why do we do what we do? We've talked a lot about that, and we're going to take a somewhat different view of it. And I should say that this week is going to be kind of, philosophy week on The World Transformed, because we're going to hit some philosophical stuff on Wednesday as well, although from perhaps a bit more practical of a standpoint. This one is just pure intellectual exercise. We're doing the hard work on Monday. I think that's only appropriate, right? If you're going to dive into the heavy sledding on philosophy, do it on a Monday. That's the way to get the week off to a good start. So we got this article over in the Wall Street Journal, and sorry if you can't get past the paywall on that, but try Googling the title of it if our link doesn't work. But it's called The Age of Enlightenment. What's it called? It's called The Enlightenment is Working, basically, by Steven Pinker. And this is a wonderful piece. The first, half to two-thirds of it is a recounting of the kinds of news that we so often report on this program. And I'll read just a little excerpt to give you a feel for this. He starts off talking about what things were like in the U.S. 30 years ago, and he talks about homicide rate and several other measures of basically economic and social well-being, and how vastly things have improved for us in the U.S. And then he takes up the global cause, and he says, globally, the 30-year scorecard also favors the present. In 1988, 23 wars raged, killing people at a rate of 3.4 per 100,000. Today, it's 12 wars, killing 1.2 per 100,000. The number of nuclear weapons has fallen from 60,780 to 10,325. In 1988, the world had just 45 democracies, embracing 2 billion people. Today it has 103, embracing 4.1 billion. That year saw 46 oil spills. 2016, just 5. And 37% of the population lived in extreme poverty, barely able to feed themselves, compared with 9.6% today. True, 2016 was a bad year for terrorism in Western Europe with 238 deaths. But 1988 was even worse, with 440. So it's a great compendium, kind of counting those down. And I like those examples because those are all kind of in the sweet spot of Steven Pinker. Obviously, he's the author of The Better Angels of Our Nature. But we talk about this all the time. He starts out talking about left and right. They disagree on almost everything, but the one thing they agree on is that the world's going to hell in a handbasket, right? They just look at it happening for different reasons, right?
That's right. And their solutions are radically different, but they agree that it's things are real bad and accelerating in how bad they're getting. And
if you talk to anyone who is highly politically motivated, I'd say there's upwards of 90% chance that their outlook on the future is reasonably bleak. It's a matter of saying things are going to be terrible unless, right? Everything's going bad, and if we don't get on board with the program, then the world is going to hell. So Steven Pinker's a little bit of a gadfly, because he's this guy who says, you know what, we've had left in power, we've had the right in power, we have had certain approaches to government, we've had other approaches to government, and here's what's generally happening. What's generally happening is everything's getting better. This is the point we make all the time. It's not unique to us. You hear it from people like Ray Kurzweil, who talks about the law of accelerating change. We've just seen this, I think, growing awareness of it over the past decade or so. But that happens at the same time that there's been this growing polarization of political discourse, and probably a lot more people persuaded that things are a lot worse maybe than they would have been, just because of how people talk about politics. So, okay, so far so good. Steven Pinker making our typical case, couldn't agree with him more. But I want to read another little passage that goes a little deeper. He says, "To what do we owe this progress? Does the universe contain a historical dialectic or arc bending toward justice? The answer is less mysterious. The Enlightenment is working. Our ancestors replaced dogma, tradition, and authority with reason, debate, and institutions of truth-seeking. They replaced superstition and magic with science, and they shifted their values from the glory of the tribe, nation, race, class, or faith toward universal human flourishing." So he's talking about the Age of Enlightenment, which basically is a, what would you call it, philosophical movement, I guess, right, that occurred
right.
back in the 18th
1700s,
century.
right?
Yeah.
18th century, 1700s, yes. And, I love the motto, basically, of the Enlightenment was dare to know, right?
Right, exactly. We could almost use that.
Yeah. And that's and because so much truth had been handed down for so long, and you can kind of see why. During actually humanity had peaked before this, right? I mean, and so we lived in the Dark Ages where you were always looking back to some grand golden age where people knew more and things were better. And so during that time, it was hard to kick off an age of enlightenment when you were always trying to appeal to authority, right? Some Plato and Aristotle and Socrates and people like that. And so we basically had to advance to a point where we were on par with those guys before the Age of Enlightenment could really kick off, right? Because we had to say, okay, we've gleaned what we could out of these guys, and we're actually getting ahead of that now. Now we can kind of relegate that to where it needs to be. These ideals were brilliant, and we owe a lot to that. But that's not the end of what we can know. So that was really the beginning of the Enlightenment, when we actually dragged ourselves, thanks to the Renaissance, out of the Dark Ages and actually got past the ancient Greeks.
It's interesting. The ancient Greeks had, for a time, at least some of the ideas that helped to drive the Enlightenment. There's a real connection between all the progress that we see in then the 19th and 20th centuries, and yes, the Enlightenment, but also the scientific revolution. We see industrialization begin, and that's driven by science. And of course, the scientific revolution is this philosophical break. It's this idea of the fundamental knowledge you need about the world is discoverable. It's something you can go out and you can find it out. You can do tests, you can do experiments, and you can learn, and you can add to the body of knowledge. That model versus, well, the body of knowledge is embedded in the wisdom of people who lived in the past, and our job is to study that and get as up to speed on all of that as we can be, and then you'll be an educated person. And by looking to what these great men of the past knew, that's the most you can hope for. That's the key. That's the height of knowledge. So when you turn this corner and you say that knowledge is this matter of going out and finding things out, that both the ordering of the natural world and then also by extension kind of the ordering of the moral universe are things that we can reason about, things that we can learn about and reason about and figure out the answers to, rather than turning to authorities. There you have not only then this big intellectual awakening, but this big political awakening, where the Enlightenment enables the thinking that led to the formation of this country, and it led to basically all of the move towards democratization in Europe. So it's this huge opening up of human perspective, and I think it's really interesting to credit that, and I think we've not thought about that very much. We have talked about over the years the human imperative being kind of our take on the law of accelerating returns, Ray Kurzweil's idea of simply we've gotten better and better at basically at encoding data, right? Isn't that what it comes down to? The better we get at encoding data, the better we get at everything else. And that has driven this tremendous technological progress, and it's what's behind the Industrial Revolution. It's what's behind the age of digitization. And if we're moving towards some really grand outcome like the technological singularity, it's that driver, it's that ability to digitize, that ability to encode data that has put us there. But I think you can look at this, and it's hard not to say, yeah, that was important, but it looks like accompanying that was this just massive change of outlook that enabled us to take advantage of that capability. Because while we had been encoding data better and better all along, we never turned that corner before. And we had opportunities to turn that corner before, too. One of the things I'm really interested in reading this, I think I've mentioned, if I haven't mentioned on the show before, I know you and I have talked about, Stephen, I've been reading this book called, actually this series of books called The Story of Civilization by Will Durant. And it's like this 12-volume story of basically all of civilized human history. And one of the things that I was really surprised by, I had just never thought about much, is when he's talking about what's happened a long time ago in China and in Asia and in some other places that I hadn't thought about. He talks about the philosophical movements that evolved in those places, or philosophers who showed up maybe 1,500 years ago in India or 1,000 years ago in China. And he says, and if you read this argument, yeah, that's essentially Immanuel Kant, right? This argument is indistinguishable from what Kant says in the categorical imperative, the critique of pure reason. Or this guy is exactly like Rousseau. And here's another one, Chinese guy writing 1,100 years ago, very much like Hobbes, almost the same arguments. So these ideas from the Enlightenment, they popped up. They showed up earlier in human history, but we didn't have the Enlightenment. Now, why is that? Well, it could be several things. It could be that it did have to be timed with, we just hit that right phase of being able to encode data. That's one possibility, right?
Right.
The other possibility
had to be post printing press. I'm pretty sure.
Well, they invented printing in China a long time ago. That's the thing. They've had it forever. So it could have happened there, right? But it didn't.
Yeah.
So there might have been other factors. And of course, printing was a different deal in China because the Latin alphabet has 26 characters. The Chinese pictograms, there's like 60,000 of them, right? So even though they invented movable type a long time ago, it might have made a huge difference in terms of how well that caught on. So it could be that actually moving printing to the West was an example of being able to encode data a lot better, just because we have this much more efficient way of printing information. But yeah, it's possible it was that. It's possible that it was some other kind of subtle advances that we don't know. It's also possible that you did have a guy in India saying it 1,500 years ago and a guy in China saying it 1,100 years ago. But what you had here in the Enlightenment was all these guys within 100 years of each other saying these things, right? And
they
being
can play off
to
of one another. It's since they're in roughly the same time and place, they can play off with each other. And we should not tip our hat to at least 3 Americans that were to some extent and tangentially involved, right? You got Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson and James Madison.
Yeah, well, not from our standpoint, certainly not just tangentially. They brought those ideas here.
They were the fountainhead of enlightenment for our country, right?
Yeah,
for the United States. But at least Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin actually probably made contributions on the continent in Europe, right? So because they were there. Can I just backtrack and just say the earliest example I know of Enlightenment thinking, Phil? I want to just kind of throw this in.
Go ahead. Where? Yes.
Okay. The book that's not in every person's Bible, it's Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, Ecclesiasticus. Asks the question, who can know the grains of sand in the world? Or, and it's basically, the typical thing of, only God can know that. There's information for God to have, and then there's information for us to have, and it will never be, any different, right? It was that idea. Archimedes wrote a lighthearted response to that. about within 100 years of the penning of Ecclesiasticus, he writes the Sand Reckoner, and in that response, he basically goes and he says the average depth of the deserts and sand and on beaches and does some calculations and comes back with something that's probably within an order or two of magnitude of a correct response at least for the sand he could be aware of, right, in his time. And his point was not that he was going to actually tell you how much sand was in the world, but that there's so much that's not out of our reach, and just to throw up your hands and to say that it is, and that this is the eternal condition of humanity is not the right approach, is what he was trying to say.
That's
and I think that's some Enlightenment thinking very, very early. Again, he was not in the right place, was he? He didn't have printing presses and everything else to get his ideas out, and he was, I'm sure he had lots of students, but he was not a part of a group of enlightened thinkers. So
I think that's a really good point you make. And if you look, there are probably lots of little examples of enlightened thinking all through history, and by that we just mean times that it got encoded and written down and was part of a philosophical discourse. Because we know that we wouldn't even be here if human beings didn't have this kind of innate drive to figure things out and get to the answer. And what happens with the Enlightenment is that what Archimedes does there becomes the rule, right? Rather than being this opposition force. Because essentially the author of Ecclesiasticus, he represents the power of the world, right? That's who's running things, is that attitude. Right? And Archimedes comes along and says, you know what, you don't have to do it that way, you can do it this way. And in the Enlightenment, what we see happening is the political forces actually start to adopt that approach. They say, you know what, people like Archimedes have a point. We can make some progress here if we start to undertake these things. So this is good. See, I think that Pinker has really dialed into something here. I think he has really figured something out here, which is that this philosophical shift is a major part of why we're on the course we're on. And you and I, Stephen, I think already knew that it was a good course. We already knew that things were improving. But the question is, will things continue to improve? Are we going to stay on this trajectory of improvement? Does the fact that we had the Enlightenment back then guarantee it, or do we have to kind of keep the lights on, right? Do we not have to make sure that the Enlightenment continues? And if that's true, do we then not have to be on the lookout for forces that are, frankly, anti-Enlightenment at work out here in our world? And I think, those were all spoken as rhetorical questions, but I'll just answer them. Yes, we do. We have to look at this. We have to be thinking about this, because if the Enlightenment enabled our encoding of information and all of our technology to move us in those directions, an authoritarian approach to the world can just sit on top of all that technology, right? It can sit there and it can rapidly slow us down in terms of progress, and it can turn off the whole freedom thing and many of the other good developments that occurred throughout the Enlightenment. So are there anti-Enlightenment forces at work in the world today, Stephen? What do you think? In our world, say in the United States?
Absolutely. There are people that are nationalists that would appeal to a strong central government, or instead of to reason. There are any number of forces. The alt-right, the militant environmentalists, to some extent, would be the same way. Probably on the opposite end of the political spectrum. There are plenty of people that are included, and I would count us among the people that are concerned about some aspects of automation. Right? I mean, that's going to be a tough. That's going to be a tough transitional period. We agree with that, but we wouldn't want to relinquish the technology that's bringing us to this point either. So you just power through is basically the way we've kind of answered that. But there are those who are so concerned about automation that they would Luddite style just want to throw away a lot of the advances we've made. I challenge some of the people that are sort of anti-enlightenment. Go camping for a week without a shower. Give it up for 1 week, and then come back and tell me if you still feel the same way about the world that the Enlightenment has given us.
Exactly. I think it's crazy to turn your back on the thing that has opened up so much for us, and it's ironic to use. Who was it I heard talking about this the other day? I thought it was just hilarious, and it was so right on the money. You see these people on Twitter, these anti-capitalists on Twitter, right? And you can tell they're doing it from a smartphone. Right, so probably sitting on an airplane, right? Yeah. So there is this self-refuting aspect to being opposed to the Enlightenment, and I think it's true. I think it's almost like they want to be. I'm edgy because of this. No, yes. You're dumb. If you've embraced the modern world to the point that you're sitting on a jet plane jetting between destinations and you're on a smartphone. But you're espousing that. I don't know. There's maybe just completely lack a sense of irony or something. I don't know. But I think there's a wonderful spot in the middle politically where we're still pretty much pro-Enlightenment. I think the mainstream is still kind of in favor of most of that stuff, and what we see is kind of on the left and on the right these moves away from it. On the left, I think it's come up through academia, and you've got this postmodernist movement, which is really interesting. I was reading this article. I'll share the link here, talking about postmodernism as the Enlightenment gone mad, or kind of the Enlightenment turning in on itself. Because once you open things up, once you say, hey, we're not going to follow those authorities anymore, and we're going to figure things out for ourselves, you're on an interesting course. You're on a course that can lead to a lot of different directions. Well, with postmodernism, you eventually reach this point where you say, well, we challenge all authority, including our reason. We challenge all authority, including every argument that's led up to where we're sitting right now. All perspectives on the universe, and this emerges actually out of a literary criticism model that says all perspectives on a text are equally valid, which I don't agree with, speaking as a former English major, but we won't go there. But when you apply that to looking
there's some ways of reading that a text that are better than others. Yeah, I agree.
I think that's me. Yeah. But you know what? We don't have time for a whole literary thing.
Words have meaning. Let's leave it at that.
I think they do. I think authors intend things. That's why they write. But when you take that principle and then apply it to observing the world, well, we come back to one of my core subjects these days, which is reality. And I think there are interpretations of reality that are more effective than other interpretations of reality. I think there are a wide variety of ways you can look at the world, and technology is going to make it easier and easier for us to create our own realities and live in our own realities. But some of them will be valid to the extent that they actually succeed, that they actually sustain people and get people to the next step and don't kill them. And some won't. And I think it's perfectly fair to say the ones that kill you are no good, right? The ones that enslave you or kill you or do those kinds of things are bad. So the postmodernists, they push right through that and end up in a place where you can't evaluate anything, and yet then generally do adopt a narrative, and it's one that's kind of anti-Enlightenment.
Basically, since you can't trust your own reason anymore, you just have to trust me, right? That's right. Authoritative.
Essentially, you end up with a whole new authoritarianism. That's right. You end up with a whole new. We're going to decree how it is, and this is how it's going to be. And then on the other side, you've got folks involved in the alt-right, particularly the white nationalists and the dark Enlightenment. I don't know if you have to be careful and distinguish amongst groups in the alt-right anymore. I think it's just generally understood now that people who self-identify as alt-right are okay with being in a group with white nationalists and stuff like that. So if I'm offending anyone who thinks they're like the nice, legitimate alt-right, I'm sorry. You know what? You've got white nationalists in your group. You can tell me it's a delicious tuna sandwich that only has 1% dog crap, and I'm going to tell you it's a dog crap sandwich.
Keep your dog crap sandwich. We don't want it.
But there's even this group that's grown up out of that. I mean, so the white nationalists, they've adopted a whole new identity politics, which I don't think I mentioned is kind of the big driver of the narrative that the post-structuralists and postmodernists have picked up. So you got identity politics on one side, you got identity politics on the other side, and those lay down a whole set of parameters. They lay down a whole set of, this is what we have to talk about, this is what we have to focus on, and this is who's valid, this is who's not valid. Basically, anti-Enlightenment thinking, right? And you see it on both sides. The Dark Enlightenment, these guys have gone even farther than that. I mean, they're basically saying, oh yeah, the whole experiment was wrong. We need to go back to monarchies. We need to go back to authority. And it almost just goes to show you that eventually you land everywhere, right? Intellectually, anything. That is a thing I would never have expected to see become a thing in my life, right? The Dark Enlightenment. Yeah. And it's interesting that people we know, people we've had on this program, are like major movers in the Dark Enlightenment, right? Which is astounding to me. But someone came out of the whole transhumanist movement and went in that direction. I think went in exactly the opposite direction of where we need to go. And more recently, just on a personal note, on Facebook, I had to unfriend somebody a couple weeks ago just because I've seen him slowly go down this white nationalist path. And I just couldn't stand to read it anymore.
I know who you're talking about. Won't say his name, but that's a sad thing to see. So basically, Phil, what we're saying to some extent is that there's many roads, but they tend to lead only two places, right? To some sort of authoritarian kind of world or to a freer world, right? I mean, it's and you got to be careful, I guess, what roads you get on and where it takes you.
I think that's right. I think either you're on a path that's saying people should be freer, and that we've got to keep figuring things out, and we've got more to learn, or you're on a path that says people should be less free, and I've got the answer.
We can acknowledge that, hey, our reason is maybe not 100% perfect, and we're gonna figure things out that are wrong initially, and then have to go back and we can acknowledge that our imperfection, but still say it's the best tool we've got, right? I mean, we can't throw away reason just because occasionally we reason something wrong. And so
that's right. That's exactly right. You're throwing out the baby with the bathwater at that point, and
that's right.
And you got nothing left. If at that point, what you have left is the will to power, right? Whoever can talk the loudest, and whoever can enforce what they say with the most guns wins. Once you put reason away, and basically that's the world we lived in before the Enlightenment. Right? I mean, the winners were the people who had the armies to back them up, and their truth that they handed down. I mean, they considered a good truth, and it had a whole civilization backing it up. But we weren't going to progress to where we are with that.
Yeah, I mean, it's the idea of the divine right of sovereigns, right? I mean, God chose your king, and your king, and you also have your the church, and it's going to tell you what to believe, and then the monarch is going to tell you what wars to fight, and that's pretty much your life,
Yeah, and it's astounding. I mean, the Dark Enlightenment folks, they're saying, "Yep, we got to go back to that," because democracy gives you bad results sometimes, and it's like, oh, you're right, it does give you bad results sometimes, but monarchy is a bad result every time, right? I mean, there's no way that's going to be the right answer.
It's been said about democracy, and it may have been Winston Churchill who said it, that it's a terrible form of government. It's just the best one we have.
Yeah, well, it's the worst form of government except for all the others, is what Churchill said.
Except for all the others, yes, that's what.
And I think that's I think that's still true. I think that's exactly right. So there you have it. We are pro-Enlightenment at the World Transformed. We're taking a big stand here. Okay, we're taking
I've got a mental image of us standing in the harbor with a with the torch, Phil. It's
That's right. That's right. We're all about liberty, fraternity, equality. Maybe, and it's interesting. We'll explore this further at some point, because I know there's distinction made sometimes between the English Enlightenment and the French Enlightenment. But we didn't take, it's a half-hour show. We didn't take the chance to go all that deep in there. And it leads to Kant, it leads to Nietzsche, and there's all these paths we can walk down, and you can talk about how it ultimately led, it leads to Marx, and it leads to its own self-refutation. But somewhere back there was a good collection of ideas, and there's a real turning point in human history. And as Steven Pinker points out, you can see the results of it by looking around at the improvements in the world that we see today. Now, we want to double down on those improvements. And the way to do that is to keep the lights on. And with that, Steven, right, I think we're going to let that be the last word.
Absolutely.
We'll pick it up on Wednesday with another philosophical topic. So great talking with you. Great having you all with us. And until next time, live to see it.